My name is Bonnie, and at 56 years old, I thought I had learned everything there was to know about motherhood. I had raised my son Marcus to be independent, caring, and strong, but when he invited me on what he called a family bonding trip to Colorado, I felt a flutter of hope in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the chance to finally connect with his wife Sarah and heal the growing distance between us. I had been trying so hard to be the perfect mother in law, but somehow everything I did seemed to make things worse. As I packed my bags in Chicago, I had no idea that this trip would change everything. Before I tell you what happened that changed everything, drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button if you have ever felt like you were trying too hard to fix a relationship. And trust me, you will want to subscribe because what happened next will shock you. I had been a kindergarten teacher for 34 years before retiring 2 years ago. My life had always revolved around taking care of others first, my students, and always my son Marcus. He was 32 now, a successful software engineer with a beautiful wife named Sarah who worked in marketing. They had been married for 4 years, and I could feel the walls going up between us from the very beginning. Sarah always said I was too involved, too controlling. She would make comments about how I did not respect boundaries, how I still treated Marcus like he was a child. I tried so hard to prove her wrong. When they got engaged, I stayed out of the wedding planning. When they bought their first house, I waited for them to ask for my opinion instead of offering it freely. But nothing I did seemed to make a difference. When Sarah suggested this trip to Aspen, saying it was time for us to bond as a family, I felt a surge of hope. Marcus was enthusiastic about the idea, and for the first time in years, it felt like we might actually be able to work things out. I spent weeks planning, bought them both thoughtful gifts, and booked my flight from Chicago to Denver with genuine excitement. Meeting them at Denver International Airport, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. Marcus hugged me tight, and even Sarah seemed genuinely happy to see me. We picked up the rental SUV, a spacious vehicle that Marcus insisted on driving while Sarah claimed the passenger seat. I settled into the back, watching the Colorado landscape unfold through the windows as we headed toward the mountains. But the warning signs started almost immediately. When I suggested stopping at a local restaurant I had researched, Sarah would politely decline, saying she had already made reservations elsewhere. When I offered to help navigate or pointed out interesting sights along the way, Sarah would respond with short answers that made it clear my input was not welcome. Marcus stayed quiet during these exchanges, not defending me, but not supporting his wife either. At the hotel in Aspen, I discovered that Sarah had booked me a room on a different floor from theirs. When I asked about it, she explained that she thought I would appreciate the privacy. The way she said it made it clear that the privacy was more for them than for me. I smiled and thanked her, but inside I was starting to feel like an outsider on what was supposed to be our family trip. That first evening at dinner, the tension became impossible to ignore. Sarah began openly criticizing the way I had raised Marcus, suggesting that I had never taught him to be truly independent. When I tried to explain my parenting philosophy, she cut me off mid-sentence. "That is exactly the problem, Bonnie. You always think you know better." I felt my face flush with embarrassment as other diners turned to look at us. Marcus stared down at his plate, saying nothing. That night, alone in my hotel room, I wondered if coming on this trip had been a terrible mistake. The second day started with what should have been a beautiful visit to Maroon Bells, those iconic twin peaks that everyone talks about when they visit Colorado. The morning light on the mountains was absolutely breathtaking, the kind of view that should bring people together in shared wonder. Instead, I found myself watching from the sidelines as Sarah directed an impromptu photo session. She had Marcus pose in dozens of different positions, capturing their love against the dramatic backdrop. When I offered to take some photos so she could be in them too, she handed me her phone with barely concealed impatience. But when I suggested we take some family photos with all three of us, her response cut deep. "We need some shots without the extra person," she said, not even bothering to lower her voice. Marcus glanced at me with what might have been sympathy, but he did not contradict his wife. I stood there holding their phone, feeling like exactly what Sarah had called me, an extra person. The mountain air suddenly felt thin, and it was not because of the altitude. The drive to Snowmass Village for lunch was quiet, filled with the kind of tension that makes every small sound seem amplified. I tried to focus on the scenery, telling myself that things would improve, that this was just a rough patch we needed to work through. But I could feel something building like the pressure before a storm. At the restaurant, Sarah ordered wine for herself and Marcus without asking what I might want. When the server asked if I would like anything to drink, Sarah answered for me before I could respond. She will just have water. She does not really drink. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. She was literally speaking for me, making decisions about what I could and could not have while simultaneously accusing me of being controlling. The irony was not lost on me, but I bit my tongue and said nothing. Then, the real attack began. Sarah started talking about how suffocating my relationship with Marcus had always been, how I had never allowed him to develop real independence. Her voice grew louder with each accusation. You suffocated Marcus his whole life. He cannot even make a decision without looking over his shoulder for Mommy's approval. I felt my chest tighten, but I tried to respond calmly. I raised him to be independent and caring. Those are good qualities. Caring or controlling. There is a difference, and you never learned it. The words hit me like physical blows. Other diners were staring now, and I could feel my face burning with humiliation. But what happened next broke my heart completely. Marcus finally spoke up, but not in the way I had desperately hoped he would. Mom, maybe Sarah has a point. You do tend to hover. I felt the blood drain from my face as my own son continued. I have been trying to find a way to tell you this, but your constant advice and opinions make us feel suffocated. The restaurant seemed to spin around me. This was my son, the boy I had raised alone after his father left when he was just 8 years old. The child I had worked 2 jobs to support, who I had helped with every homework assignment, every heartbreak, every challenge life threw at him. I was just trying to help. I love you both, I whispered. Love is not supposed to feel like pressure, Mom. Those words would replay in my mind for weeks. That night, Sarah announced that they had decided to cut the trip short. They would drive me back to Denver in the morning so I could catch an earlier flight home. The decision had already been made without any input from me, of course. I lay awake all night in that hotel room, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction I had ever had with them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been too involved, too controlling. Maybe my version of love really had felt like pressure to them. But even if that was true, did it justify the cruel way they had treated me? The drive back to Denver the next morning was silent except for the GPS giving directions and the occasional comment about traffic. I sat in the back seat like a scolded child, watching the beautiful Colorado mountains disappear behind us as we descended toward the plains. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. We stopped for lunch in a tiny town called Fairplay, population 680, according to the sign we passed. It was the kind of small mountain community that probably looked charming to tourists but felt isolated and forgotten to the people who lived there year-round. Marcus parked in front of a small diner with hand-painted signs and mismatched outdoor furniture. Inside the diner, I made what I thought was an innocent gesture. When the waitress came to take our order, I started to suggest what Marcus might like the way I had done 1,000 times throughout his life. It was such an automatic response that I did not even think about it. But Sarah exploded before I could finish the sentence. See, this is exactly what I am talking about. He is 32 years old. Her voice carried across the small restaurant and every head turned toward our table. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life, but something inside me finally snapped. I was tired of being treated like a villain for caring about my son. You know what? You are right. Maybe I have been too involved, I said quietly. Finally, some self-awareness. Sarah responded with satisfaction. But that does not give you the right to humiliate me in public or turn my son against me. I continued, my voice growing stronger. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Marcus, we are leaving. Your mother can figure out her own way home. I watched in disbelief as my son hesitated for just a moment, looking between his wife and his mother. For one brief second, I thought he might stand up for me, might finally choose our relationship over his wife's cruelty. But he did not. Marcus stood up and followed Sarah toward the door. I scrambled to catch up with them, leaving money on the table for our barely touched food. Marcus, please, I called after them as they reached their rental car. He turned back to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret or maybe just embarrassment, but he did not stop. He got in the driver's seat while Sarah slammed the passenger door. As they pulled away, Sarah actually rolled down her window and waved at me with a smile that was pure malice. She was laughing as they drove down the main street of Fairplay, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with nothing but my purse and my phone. I stood there for a long time, watching their car disappear around a curve in the road. The mountain air was thin and cold, and I could feel the stares of locals who had witnessed the scene. For the first time In my adult life, I was completely alone with no one to take care of and no one to take care of me. My first instinct was to call a taxi to take me back to Denver. I could still catch a flight home that evening, lick my wounds, and try to figure out how to repair this relationship from a distance. I actually made the call and arranged for a driver to pick me up in 20 minutes. But as I stood on that sidewalk, something shifted inside me. Why should I go running back to Chicago with my tail between my legs? Why should I be the one to apologize and grovel for forgiveness when I had done nothing wrong except love my son too much? When the taxi arrived, I shocked myself by what I said. Actually, I have changed my mind. Can you take me to whatever motel this town has instead? The driver, a weathered man in his 60s, looked at me with curiosity but did not ask questions. He drove me 3 blocks to the Alpine Motel, a small establishment that looked like it had not been updated since the 1970s but was clean and well-maintained. The woman behind the desk introduced herself as Ruby. She was about 65, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. When I explained that I needed a room and was not sure for how long, she studied me for a moment before handing me a key. Room 7. Best view in the place. You running from something or toward something? I do not know yet, I answered honestly. Sometimes we need to get lost to find ourselves, Ruby said with a knowing nod. That first week in Fairplay was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For the first time in decades, I had no responsibilities, no schedule, no one depending on me for anything. The town was so small that I could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes, but somehow it felt like a whole new world. I started each morning with coffee at Tom's Coffee Corner, a tiny shop run by a man in his 70s who had moved to Fairplay after retiring from teaching high school in Denver. Tom had that easy way of making conversation that made newcomers feel welcome without being intrusive. He told me about the town's history, how it had been a mining community back in the gold rush days, how most of the current residents were either retirees looking for a quiet life or young families who worked remotely and wanted to raise their kids surrounded by mountains instead of traffic. The town library became my second home. Maria, the librarian, was a woman about my age who had moved here from Mexico City with her husband 20 years earlier. She introduced me to books I had never made time to read when I was busy being a mother and teacher. Travel memoirs, books about starting over, stories of women who had found themselves later in life. But it was Maria who first suggested I learn Italian. You have that look, she said one afternoon as I checked out another travel book. What look? The look of someone who is ready to try something completely different. There is this app I heard about for learning languages. Why not start with something beautiful? I downloaded the language learning app that very evening and began with the most basic Italian phrases. Sitting in my little motel room repeating "mi chiamo Bonnie" to my phone, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Excitement about learning something new just for myself. As the days passed, I found myself hiking the trails around Fairplay, something I had never done in Chicago. The physical activity and mountain air cleared my mind in ways I had not expected. I started taking pictures with my phone, capturing the way the light fell on the peaks at different times of day, the wildflowers that grew in impossible places, the vast sky that seemed to stretch forever. Ruby became an unexpected friend and advisor. She had moved to Fairplay 15 years earlier after her husband died selling their house in suburban Phoenix and deciding she wanted to live somewhere that felt real instead of manufactured. In the evenings, she would invite me to sit on the motel's small porch and we would talk about life choices and the courage it takes to start over. You know what I learned when I came here? Ruby said one evening as we watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. I learned that I had spent so many years being Harold's wife and my children's mother that I had forgotten how to be just Ruby. Sounds like maybe you are having the same realization about being just Bonnie. She was right. For the first time since Marcus was born 32 years ago, I was not defining myself by my relationship to him. I was not Marcus's mother or Sarah's mother-in-law or even a retired teacher. I was just a woman named Bonnie figuring out what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. My Italian lessons progressed from basic greetings to simple conversations. I found myself daydreaming about actually visiting Italy, something that had always seemed like a fantasy reserved for other people with more money or fewer responsibilities. But sitting in that motel room doing my lessons while looking out at the mountains, the fantasy started feeling more like a possibility. 2 weeks into my stay in Fairplay, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going home to Chicago. At least, not yet. I used my laptop to research flights to Rome, something I had never seriously considered before. The retirement savings I had been so careful to preserve suddenly seemed less important than the adventure I had never allowed myself to have. When I found a flight leaving Denver in 3 days, I booked it before I could change my mind. The flight to Rome was the longest I had ever taken, 13 hours with a connection in Amsterdam. I spent most of the journey alternating between excitement and terror. What was I doing? I was 56 years old, traveling alone to a country where I barely spoke the language, with no real plan beyond wanting to experience something completely different. But when I landed at Fiumicino Airport and heard Italian being spoken all around me, something clicked into place. This was exactly where I was supposed to be. I spent 3 days in Rome, staying in a small hotel near the Pantheon and walking until my feet hurt. I practiced my Italian with patient shopkeepers, got lost in the narrow streets, and ate meals at tiny restaurants where the only other customers were locals. For the first time in decades, no one knew anything about me except that I was an American woman traveling alone. On my 4th day, I took a train to Tuscany. I had fallen in love with the photos of rolling hills covered in vineyards and olive groves, the medieval towns perched on hilltops like something from a fairy tale. I found a small apartment to rent in Montalcino, a town famous for its wine, through a website that connected travelers with local hosts. The apartment was owned by Lorenzo, a man about my age whose wife had died 3 years earlier. He lived in the main house on his small vineyard property and rented out the guest apartment to help supplement his income. When I arrived, he greeted me in careful English mixed with expressive Italian gestures. Lorenzo was nothing like the men I had known in Chicago. He was weathered by outdoor work with calloused hands and deep lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun. But he had a gentleness about him, a way of moving through the world that suggested he understood that life was both precious and fragile. He offered to teach me about winemaking, partly because he needed help with the English language marketing for his small operation, and partly because he seemed genuinely delighted to have someone who was interested in learning. I spent my mornings helping him tend the vines and my afternoons practicing Italian with the other locals who gathered at the small cafe in the town square. For the first time in my adult life, I was being appreciated for who I was in the moment, not for the roles I had played or the responsibilities I had carried. Lorenzo and his friends did not care that I had been a kindergarten teacher or that I was someone's mother. They only cared that I was curious, willing to work, and eager to learn about their way of life. I enrolled in cooking classes at a small school run by Nonna Francesca, a woman in her 80s who taught traditional Tuscan recipes to tourists and locals alike. My Italian improved rapidly when I was learning to make fresh pasta or discussing the proper way to prepare wild boar ragu. There is something about cooking together that breaks down language barriers faster than any textbook. My relationship with Lorenzo developed slowly and naturally. He would invite me to dinner after long days working in the vineyard, and we would sit on his terrace overlooking the valley, sharing stories about our lives. He told me about his late wife, how they had built the vineyard together from nothing, and how lonely the house had felt since she died. I told him about Marcus, about the divorce when my son was young, about the years of putting everyone else's needs before my own. One evening, about 3 weeks into my stay, Lorenzo took my hand as we sat watching the sunset. "Bonnie, you have been running from something painful, yes. But I think maybe now you are running towards something beautiful." He was right. I was not the same woman who had been abandoned in a parking lot in Colorado. That woman had been broken, defeated, unsure of her own worth. This woman was discovering passions she had never allowed herself to explore, forming connections based on mutual interest and respect rather than obligation and guilt. I started a social media account to document my Italian adventure, posting photos of the countryside, the food I was learning to make, the new friends I was meeting. It felt important to create a record of this transformation, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might be wondering if it was possible to start over later in life. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Marcus was beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. At first, he and Sarah assumed I would come home within a few days, tail between my legs, ready to apologize and accept their boundaries. When a week passed without any contact beyond my brief text saying I was safe, Marcus started to worry. When 2 weeks passed and my neighbors told him I had not returned home, he began calling hospitals and police stations in Colorado. He filed a missing person report, convinced something terrible had happened to me. The guilt was eating him alive, especially as he started to remember our relationship before Sarah came into the picture. He remembered how I had worked 2 jobs to pay for his college education, how I had never missed a single baseball game or school play, how I had been both mother and father to him after his dad left. He began to realize that what Sarah called controlling behavior had actually been love, perhaps overly protective love, but genuine care nonetheless. Sarah, on the other hand, was irritated by his concern. She insisted that I was being dramatic, that I would come crawling back as soon as I got tired of whatever game I was playing. But as the days turned into weeks and there was still no word from me, even she began to feel uneasy about what they had done. It was a private investigator who finally tracked me down through credit card records and passport information. Marcus learned that I had flown to Rome and was currently living in a small town in Tuscany. The investigator provided an address, but no other details about what I was doing or who I was with. Without telling Sarah, Marcus booked a flight to Italy. He needed to see for himself that I was okay, and he needed to apologize for what had happened in fair play. But when Sarah discovered his travel plans, she insisted on coming with him. Whether it was genuine concern or a desire to maintain control over the situation, I would never know. They arrived in Montalcino on a Tuesday afternoon in early October. The town was at its most beautiful, with the autumn harvest in full swing and the vineyards turning brilliant shades of gold and red. They found Lorenzo's property easily enough following the directions the private investigator had provided, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw when they arrived. I was in the vineyard with Lorenzo laughing as he tried to teach me the proper technique for testing grape readiness. My skin was tanned from weeks in the Italian sun, my hair was longer and lighter than it had been in years, and I was wearing clothes I had bought in local shops rather than the conservative outfits I had favored in Chicago. But more than my appearance, it was my demeanor that shocked them. I looked happy, not just content or making the best of a difficult situation, but genuinely, radiantly happy in a way Marcus realized he had not seen in years. When I spotted them walking up the gravel path toward the vineyard, my first emotion was not joy or relief, but annoyance at having my peace disturbed. For 6 weeks, I had not thought about their expectations, their judgments, or their needs. I had been living entirely for myself, and it had been magnificent. Mom, Marcus called out as he approached, his voice uncertain. "We have been so worried about you." I straightened up slowly, wiping my hands on the apron Nonna Francesca had given me. "Have you?" I asked calmly. "Because the last time I saw you, you drove away laughing while I stood alone in a parking lot." The confrontation that followed was unlike any conversation I had ever had with my son. For the first time in his life, I was not trying to make him comfortable or smooth over an awkward situation. I was not rushing to reassure him that everything was fine or that I forgave him. I was simply telling the truth about how his actions had affected me. Sarah looked around at the vineyard, at Lorenzo hovering protectively nearby, at my obvious comfort and happiness in this place, and I could see her calculating. This was not the broken, defeated woman she had expected to find. This was someone who had built a new life without them. Someone who clearly did not need to be rescued. "We came to bring you home," Sarah said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I am home," I replied simply. Marcus started to cry, then really cry in a way I had not seen since he was a little boy. All the guilt and regret he had been carrying poured out of him. "Mom, I am so sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should never have let Sarah treat you that way. I should never have abandoned you like that." For a moment, my maternal instincts kicked in, and I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was okay and that we could just forget it ever happened. But I had learned too much about myself in the past 6 weeks to go back to that pattern. "Marcus, I love you more than anything in this world. You are my son, and you always will be. But I will not accept being treated with disrespect anymore. Not by anyone, including you." Sarah stepped forward then, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. "Bonnie, I owe you an apology. I was threatened by your relationship with Marcus, and I handled it terribly. What we did in Colorado was cruel and inexcusable." It was the first time she had ever acknowledged her behavior, let alone apologized for it. I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or strategic positioning. "I appreciate that, Sarah, but an apology does not undo the damage. You spent 4 years trying to convince my son that loving him was the same as controlling him. You succeeded in making him feel guilty for having a relationship with his mother. That kind of poison does not disappear overnight." Lorenzo appeared at my side then, not saying anything but making his support clear through his presence. Marcus looked between us, beginning to understand that this was not a temporary rebellion or a cry for attention. This was a woman who had found a completely different way to live. "Are you happy here?" Marcus asked quietly. "Happier than I have been in years," I answered honestly. We spent the next 2 hours talking, really talking in a way we had not done since Marcus was a teenager. I told them about my life in Montalcino, about the friends I had made, about the work I was doing with Lorenzo, about the Italian classes and cooking lessons and photography. I told them about waking up each morning excited about the day ahead, instead of worried about whether I was doing enough for other people. Marcus began to understand that his mother was not the same woman who had raised him. That woman had defined herself entirely through her relationships with others. This woman had discovered interests and passions that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or teacher or caretaker. I also told them about the boundaries I had established for myself. I would not tolerate being spoken to disrespectfully. I would not accept having my love characterized as control, and I would not automatically prioritize their needs above my own well-being. If you want to rebuild our relationship, I said, it has to be based on mutual respect. I am not going to chase after your approval anymore. Sarah was quiet throughout most of this conversation, but I could see her processing everything. She was realizing that the dynamic she had worked so hard to disrupt no longer existed anyway. I was not competing with her for Marcus's attention or trying to control their decisions. I had found my own life separate from theirs, and I was thriving in it. Before they left Montalcino, Marcus made a commitment that surprised both Sarah and me. "I want to come back and visit you here," he said. "Not to convince you to come home, but because I want to understand this new life you have built. I want to know who my mother is when she is not busy taking care of everyone else." I told him he was welcome anytime, as long as he came with respect and genuine curiosity rather than judgment or expectations. Sarah was slower to make peace with the situation, but she did acknowledge that seeing me happy and independent had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. She promised to work on treating me with the respect I deserved, though I could tell it would be a process for her. After they left, Lorenzo and I sat on his terrace drinking wine and watching the sun set over the valley. I felt emotionally drained, but also lighter, as if a weight I had carried for years had finally been lifted. "You handled that well," Lorenzo said in his careful English. "I am learning that love without respect is not really love at all," I replied. "It is control disguised as caring, and that is not healthy for anyone." 6 months later, I am still in Montalcino. I have extended my visa, enrolled in an intensive Italian language program, and started the process of obtaining wine certification. My little social media account documenting my Italian adventure has grown to thousands of followers, people who are inspired by the idea that it is never too late to start over. Lorenzo and I have grown closer, though we are taking things slowly. We both understand the importance of maintaining our individual identities while building something beautiful together. He has taught me that love can be supportive without being suffocating, that caring for someone does not mean managing their choices. Marcus has visited twice, once with Sarah and once alone. During his solo visit, we had conversations about his childhood, about the choices I made as a single mother, about the pressure we both felt to be everything to each other. We are building a new relationship based on who we are now, rather than the roles we used to play. Sarah and I will probably never be close friends, but we have reached a place of mutual respect. She has stopped trying to limit Marcus's contact with me, and I have stopped offering unsolicited advice about their life choices. We can be in the same room without tension, which is more progress than I ever expected. My friends back in Chicago were shocked when I told them I was not coming back, at least not permanently. Some of them thought I was having some kind of breakdown, running away from my responsibilities and my life. But others understood that I was running towards something I had never allowed myself to have, a life that was entirely my own. The truth is, being abandoned in that small town in Colorado was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover who Bonnie was when she was not busy being Marcus's mother or anyone else's caretaker. It gave me permission to pursue dreams I had never even admitted to having. I spent 32 years being Marcus's mother, and I was good at it. But at 56, I finally learned how to be Bonnie. I learned that love without respect is not love at all. It is control disguised as caring. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop trying to manage their life and start living your own. They left me stranded in a small town thinking they were punishing me. Instead, they set me free. Sometimes the best thing that happens to you comes wrapped in the worst moment of your life. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover, everything you actually needed. I wake up every morning now excited about the possibilities ahead of me. I am learning a new language, mastering new skills, building new relationships based on mutual interest and respect, rather than obligation and history. I am finally the protagonist of my own story, instead of a supporting character in someone else's. And you know what? That feels absolutely magnificent. So tell me, have you ever had a moment when you realized you needed to choose yourself over everyone else's expectations? Drop a comment below and share your story because I would love to hear about your journey to finding yourself. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about starting over and finding courage later in life. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that it is never too late to choose yourself. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes getting lost is exactly how you find your way home to yourself. Until next time, keep choosing courage over comfort.